Now, we wouldn't be here without our sponsors, and I want to take just a moment to recognize those. You saw the scroll before we started today. We have 2 levels of GEMS sponsorship. This is a new program this year. GEMS are our year-long sponsors that provide a one-time payment for sponsorship of everything EBA does. We have our diamond level GEM sponsors, Denton's and NRECA. We have our emerald level GEM sponsors, Duncan Weinberg, Ginzer, and Pembroke, Paul Hastings, and White and Case. And in addition to our year-long sponsors, we have significant sponsorship of this meeting itself. Our Wi-Fi sponsor this year is Charles River Associates. Our charging station sponsor is Ameren. Our closing dinner sponsor is Phelps Dunbar LLP. Our luncheon sponsor is, sponsors is Alston and Bird and Eastern Generation LLC. Our coffee break sponsors are Fortis and PSEG. Our tabletop exhibitor sponsor is the Foster Report. Our supporting sponsor is McCarter and English. And our Women in Energy breakfast sponsors are Jones Day and McGuire Woods. Our conference guide sponsors are McNess. And our marketing sponsors are RTO, Insider, and Missouri Energy Initiative. I'd like everyone, if you would, please give a round of applause to our sponsors and thank them. Of course, this event obviously wouldn't also be available to you and at the high level of quality of programming if it wasn't for our Professional Education Council leadership and volunteers. This year, we are very blessed to have 4 excellent leaders of the Professional Education Council who put out a call for topics, and I think you will agree the call for topics really resulted in a really robust round of topics that we're going to be discussing today. And just so you know, if you have a topic you see that's not represented today or that maybe you want a different spin on, the call for topics is something we're going to continue to do. And so look for that, and if you think that something needs to be discussed that we haven't covered, please reach out when you see that in your inbox. So our Professional Education Council leadership, our co-chairs are Norm Peterson and Tom Millar, and our vice co-chairs are Jamie Blackburn and Candace Castagnada. And if you would indulge me, please give them a round of applause for all the work they did this. At this time, I'm going to introduce Norm Peterson, co-chair of the Professional Education Council, who will kick off the rest of our event. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Matt. My name is Norman Peterson. First of all, I really do want to thank all of you who did respond to the call for ideas for this Mid-Year Energy Forum. I can't tell you how helpful it was to the Professional Education Council to have the great ideas you suggested. We're going to be having an annual meeting coming up. You know, it's going to be coming up in the spring. There will be another call for ideas. And please, if you could give us your ideas, that would be just terrific. It was, to the extent to which this program turns out to meet your expectations, in large part, it was due to your response to the call for ideas. Having said that, I have a very easy job at this moment, and it's to introduce the moderator for our upcoming first panel. It's a set of TED Talks, and the moderator is going to be Peter Esposito from Cresta Butte Analytics. And you know, this is the second time I've done this. At the annual meeting, we did have sort of a trial run on having some TED Talks. Peter not only was the moderator, but gave a TED Talk on essentially the topic for this entire plenary session, New Tech, Aging Regs. So you've already heard him once. He's now back.
Please listen to me again.
I'm very happy to say Peter Esposito from Cresta Butte Analytics, who will introduce the speakers for the plenary session. Peter?
Thank you, Norman. I think I'm wired.
You're wired.
I'd like to first of all thank the EBA for letting me do this, because this is something that's really been on my mind for a long time. And it's one of those things where we've gone through 40 years of change in the industry, and before I retire, I want to do as much as I can to leave something for my kids that we're all going to be proud of. And I think we got a way to go, and I think we got a vehicle to do that, and that's new technology. The question really then is, can a 100-year-old regulatory paradigm accommodate and encourage that new technology? And I am thrilled to have 6 great speakers on this panel. I gave the pitch that basically said, let's have the discussion. These are the people who know what they're talking about in the context of this discussion. So without further ado, let's start with Nora Brownell. I think you all know Nora. Round of applause for Nora.
My dear.
Former state commissioner, NARU president, FERC commissioner, consultant, current utility board member, and what am I missing?
Oh, superstar, just all around superstar. Let's go for it. What the hell?
Next is Hannah Pokolov. Hannah works with Advanced Energy Economy. I can't see over there.
I think she's not next.
Pardon me?
I think someone else is.
No, I jiggered the list. I'm sorry. I didn't tell you guys that. Got to keep you off balance a little bit. Right here.
Right. He's changing the order.
Yeah. There's a reason I won't.
You give them a TED Talk and you never get them back.
Hannah represents a wide variety of technology companies that could change the way we consume energy. I'll leave it at that. And she'll show you how much she knows when she starts talking. Next up is Gregg Wattenberg. Gregg is the CEO of a company named SmartWires. When I started in the industry, I was a gas guy, and gas has valves. And I learned later that power has switches. And that changes the way you can use a system, especially in cases of loop flow. Gregg has a solution to that I think we could utilize and learn from and perhaps think about new models. So he's going to be talking about that. Next is Susan Polk. Susan is one of the leading consultants in organized markets, and she warned me that she doesn't know everything about carbon pricing in organized markets, but I know she knows 100 times more than I do, which will probably be plenty for everybody in the audience. Next is Dr. Mark Jameson, who is in a certain sense our outsider. He's kind of inside and outside. He consults and educates people on a variety of industries, and Mark can bring us some examples of what have been done in other industries to move things along and what might apply well in our industry. And finally, Kelly Speaks Bachman, who we can blame for changing up the order because she wanted to sit on that end because she's wearing a skirt.
Yep.
Kelly represents the Energy Storage Association and is very well respected and knows a lot about other parts of the industry too. So what we're going to do right now is, I'll kind of set it up a little bit. I see 4 main drivers right now in where we're going in the future of the energy industry. First is climate change, whether you believe it or not. There's lots of people who do. I personally do. And as a result, we're seeing the deployment of solar, wind, a lot of new technologies. And how, in my mind, is how can we do this in a cost-effective and effective manner? The next is technology, which is, it says how we use power and the demand side, but I'm sure there's all sorts of other things on how we make power that Hannah will be able to talk about, and hopefully lots of other people. Third is Insul's 100-year-old regulatory paradigm. I got a question for the audience. How many of you have heard of the Averett-Johnson effect? Not bad. I had never heard of it till last night on a plane. And it's the incentive for utilities to spend capital dollars and not necessarily efficiency dollars. Never knew it had a name, so now we have a name for it. And the final thing is politics and pricing. We all know there's a lot of subsidies, standards, renewable portfolio standards, and other politics that it's getting into the mix. And how does that all relate to where we were going over the last couple decades of market competition and pricing? And how do these all come together at the end? So what I'm going to do is we're going to have a lead off, about 5 minutes per speaker, to talk about what they bring to the discussion, what you do, who you represent, what role you play in deploying technology that impacts the markets and could help with climate change specifically. What do you view as the most promising technologies out there, or class of technologies that could have a positive impact on the production, transmission, distribution of power, and the need to deal with climate change again? And finally, if you had 2 to 3 things you could change that would bring us the biggest bang for the buck, what would they be? And Nora, those are simple questions. We'll start with you.
There's the executive summary of that. Well, I come to you obviously as a believer in markets. I always have. I now see it not only through the lens as a recovering regulator, but as a utility board member, as a pipeline board member. So I've looked at that industry, and I'm on the board of a couple of small technology companies and an infrastructure fund. So I can see this from a broad perspective, but here's what I see. I see climate change, whether we call it anything or not. It's extreme storms. It's a system that is unable to respond as we would once have wished. It's a system that's mature, that relies on mature technology, mature information systems, and frankly, a very antiquated idea of customers. And as we see a generational change, I think we're going to see that come into effect quite a bit. It relies on a regulatory process that is in itself not only antiquated, but inefficient and getting to the wrong things. And finally, it's relying too much on government intervention for success. Governments and regulators should create a framework for lots of different solutions. Their role is not to protect a monopoly. Their role is not to protect individuals. Their role is to really open the door to change. And that's why I'm here, because mostly I'm here as a bomb thrower, and that's what people know me as. But I've been predicting change in an industry for 20 years. I've been wrong for 20 years. And now what I see, thank God, are technologies that are going to disrupt or get behind one way or the other. So right now, we're protecting institutions as gatekeepers, and that won't last for long. So we can either play a role in designing a glide path for new business models for the utilities and new entrants, or we can see an industry that slowly declines the way we've seen it in other kinds of industries that have had a lot of energy spent, no pun intended, protecting old business models that frankly just can't attract the capital, because ultimately, I've always believed that the energy sector is about economic development, and as such is the answer to environmental issues and welfare issues that we have to consider in its totality and not just in isolation. So I don't pick winners and losers. What I pick are the kinds of rules that will allow us to see a vast number of solutions. So we spent a lot of time talking about generation mix, candidly, perhaps a little too much, and not enough time talking about all the T&D technologies that can add efficiency, add transparency, have applications that solve for multiple problems, like cyber, like customer interaction, because at the end of the day, we really do have customers, that can solve for reliability and resiliency, if you consider resiliency the ability to fix a problem, identify a problem very quickly. So I feel that we haven't spent enough time talking about an array of technologies, not the least of which is AI and blockchain and all kinds of other solutions. Instead, we take these sequentially. Well, we'll do a little solar, we'll do a little this, we'll do a little battery. We need to unleash and open the kimono on all of it. And last but not least, and I think this is going to be a challenge for the Energy Bar Association along with their colleagues, is the role of information. Lots of chat about big data and all that kind of stuff, but none of these solutions can really work unless there's full access to information. And I see states allowing technologies to come in to sell products to customers, but to let the utilities hold a lot of the information back from customers. The customers own it. It's only a question of time. I hope we get it right up to the Supreme Court as fast as we can. Right now it's state by state, but it's the unidentified real enemy besides antiquated regulations and government that cannot resist picking winners and losers. It's really an unresolved issue that I think we need to resolve on a national basis very quickly. So I'm here for all that reasons. Hope springs eternal. What can I say? I think change is here whether we want it to be or not. It's a question of how fast. It's a question of how many bodies it leaves in its wake. And frankly, old business models, as we've proven in every market that has restructured, will be the ones left in the wake. So that's why I'm here.
Awesome. Hannah?
What she said.
Now, I'm going to expect you to be a little bit more specific about potential technologies.
They've got the research, and I steal it all the time.
So I'm going to use some of that research here. So I'm Hannah Polakov. I'm with Advanced Energy Economy. Who are we? We are an organization of businesses that are trying to build a prosperous world that runs on clean, secure, and affordable energy. And the way that we do that is by transforming government policy to enable the rapid growth of advanced energy companies. This is just a quick look at who our members are. So you can see we represent a broad swath of different technology companies, from renewables to energy efficiency to EVs, electric vehicles, to smart grid, to even a large number of corporate companies like big corporates like Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google, who have corporate goals to deploy a number of these technologies. Okay, so here's a look at some of the numbers. So where are we now on advanced energy? You can see that the price curves of advanced energy have seen massive declines. This is just a look at levelized cost of a number of technologies. So you can see nuclear, the levelized cost is about $150 per megawatt hour. For coal, it's about $100. For combined cycle gas, it's about $60. For utility scale solar, it's $50. So it's actually here just to show folks. So you can see this amazing cost decline curve here for utility scale solar. So you can see that crossover point that happened a few years back, and now it's coming in under the traditional technologies. And then there's wind even lower at 45. And if you think that these numbers here are impressive, these were from 2017. Look at 2018. This is just a quick look at solar. So you can see these are the prices of where real utility scale PPAs, utility scale solar PPAs have been coming in over the years. And so you see now in 2018, the latest PPAs are coming in as low as $20 per megawatt hour. I mean, it's just remarkable. And the average is about 40, so even cheaper than that $50 mark we saw last year. So tremendous price decreases. PV alone has come down two-thirds since 2008. I mean, it just completely changes the game on how much these technologies cost. When you look at energy storage, you're seeing similar massive declines. So you can see that storage in just the last 7 years has seen price declines of 80%. So you can just see a huge drop, and those price declines are expected to continue. What happens when you combine solar and storage? Oh, I thought there was a... here it is. Okay, what happens when you combine solar and storage? Well, you're actually seeing that bids are coming in today for projects that'll be finished in 2021 in the Southwest, where the solar plus storage projects are outbidding by a comfortable margin combined cycle gas. So you see the combined cycle gas is coming in at about $47 per megawatt hour, and that solar plus storage is coming in at 36. Again, just remarkable numbers that just completely change the economics. This is a look at electric vehicles. Again, you're seeing these price declines. This is a look at when the crossover point is expected between the sticker price between an EV and a traditional internal combustion car. So you see that crossover is expected to come in about 2025. So it's 7 years out, not very far away. And that doesn't even account all of the cost savings that EVs have versus traditional cars that make those cars actually very cost competitive today. So if you think about avoided fuel costs, if you think about avoided maintenance, all of that already is making EVs quite cost competitive today with internal combustion cars. And by 2025, sticker price is going to be the same and then getting cheaper. So in general, technology is enabling the system to become more dynamic, more complex, and more customer-focused. As Nora mentioned, the data is a huge piece of this. You're seeing increased use of granular data, and I completely underscore her point about the importance of freeing that data and making it available so that it can be utilized in so many different ways. You're seeing two-way flows of energy, not just to customers anymore, but also now from customers and third parties, and you're seeing greater customer engagement. But you could be seeing so much more. So you're seeing these trends, but they're being limited, and they're being limited because policy and business models really need to be updated. And so specifically, what we have here is sort of, what is the old model and then what is the new model along a number of different items. So for technology, the old model was you had these big centralized generation plants. They push power one way down the lines to passive customers who just receive that power. What you're seeing now in the new model is you're seeing a proliferation of distributed energy resources, which enable two-way power flow, and you're seeing much more engaged customers who are, the term is prosumers, not just consumers, but producers as well, and can be much more dynamic with the supply and demand. On the policy spectrum, you're seeing, the old model was a policy goals focused on safety, reliability, affordability, and equitable access. Today, all of that is still true in terms of policy goals, but you're also seeing policy goals develop around resiliency, so recovery from storms, more customer choice and control, and also promoting innovative and cleaner technologies. And then on the utility business model front, the old model was you had regulated returns on capital investment, what he was talking about earlier in terms of the traditional cost of service business model. Utilities spend capital to make money, and this general incentive for them to grow their kilowatt hours so that they have a reason to build more and more capital. What you're seeing now under new models that are emerging is that you're seeing folks talk about decoupling, talking about figuring out a way to allow utilities to earn on services so that they don't just feel that they need to own everything, but they actually can do service contracts for different things that the customer would own or a third party would own. You're seeing a move towards rewarding performance, so you don't just make money. The utilities don't just make money by building and building, but they make money by actually hitting performance goals so that you're getting what you want them to be doing. And then also you're seeing this a lot of discussion and starting to, some progress being made in some states around utilities moving to become platforms for multi-sided transactions, and we can talk a little bit more about that later. So states are getting the memo on this. They're getting the memo on the need to consider utility business model reform. This is a quick snapshot of the state of utility business model reform discussions around the country. So you can see that there's a few states that are moving towards comprehensive reform. And some states in the blue are actually in the implementation phase. The states in black are exploring business model reforms, but they haven't quite gone into implementation yet. And then in orange are the states that conversations are really just starting. And just for a moment to dig a little bit deeper into what do we mean when we say utility business model reform, we generally talk about utility business model reform as two complementary paths. We talk about one path, the OpEx-CapEx path, as optimizing inputs, so equalizing the regulatory treatment of OpEx, operational expenditure alternatives, to traditional capital investments, so that utility earnings are neutral between whether they do a service solution or a capital solution that they own. And the idea there is that you want the utilities to choose the solution based on merit, not type, right? Don't just immediately choose something because it's a capital investment the utility's going to own, but actually look at the merits of the solution, and that service contract might actually be more cost-effective and a better solution. The second path is performance-based regulation. It's incenting outcomes, so introducing performance-based regulations so that utilities can earn from achieving certain state goals instead of just earning because they're investing more and more capital. Both of these paths are meant to mitigate the capital bias that utilities have under the traditional business model and to better align state, customer, and utility interests. Real quick, if you want to learn more about any of this stuff, we've done a number of reports that you can access on our website. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. Gregg's got something that I think is off the charts new technology, and at the risk of poisoning it by referring it to a gas model. We looked at the gas model years and years ago, and we got the gas pipelines out of the merchant business. And at the same time, we said you don't have to come back in for rate cases. And what did they do? They put tweak after tweak in. They loop a little sectional line. They put new compression in where it made sense. And they increased their throughput, increased their revenues, but the rates never went up. And I see what Gregg's going to talk about is having the potential to do that with power.
Thank you. Thanks, Peter. I'm going to share a little bit about who SmartWires is and what we do, and I'm hoping that I'm going to convince most of you in this room. This is really a revolutionary, I might even argue obvious, solution that utilities should embrace. And I'm not doing that because I'm hoping several hundred vice presidents of transmission were hovering around outside the hotel and have infiltrated your conference, but I think we can have a really interesting discussion, if you'll grant me. This is an obvious solution that utilities should be embracing. When we look at how SmartWires is growing internationally, and you see how it's being embraced in Europe and Australia, and how slow things are comparatively in the USA, I think we draw some really interesting insights around the incentives and the regulations that we're using to managing these utilities, and I think it'll line up a lot with what we've heard so far. So with that, I'm going to convince you of 4 things today. The first, the grid is surprisingly inefficient. The second, we need to incentivize more grid innovation. The third, we need to change, as you've heard already, how we pay utilities. And finally, this might be the slightly surprising one, we need to think a little bit more about the needs right in front of us and then a little less about the needs 10 and 20 years from now. Bear with me. I'm hoping I'll convince you. First, I need to give everyone a quick overview of how the grid works. If we look at this model here and you see generation connected to load by 3 lines, all of you can see that the top line shows a power line that's overloaded, and the second and the third lines show all kinds of excess capacity on those lines. Most people from outside the industry would look at this and say, okay, terrific, let's use the second and the third line. We can transfer a lot more power. We have to remind those of their high school physics and how power actually flows, path of least resistance, et cetera. And what you realize is this problem that you're seeing is not that the top line is overloaded, the entire path is overloaded. We can't send any more power across that path. So if you're sitting here and saying, you mean to tell me there are no valves on the transmission grid? You've got it exactly right. So SmartWires, as intuitive and obvious as it may sound, has developed what we call a smart valve. It sits on the line. It can sit anywhere along that line. It can sit on a tower, in a substation, anywhere we want to put it. And what this valve does is it watches that line, and as that line's about to heat up and get near overload, it kicks on and it introduces impedance or resistance to that line, pushing the power to the other 2 lines, and as you can see, more power transferred. We could have done the reverse. We could have gone on one of the second 2 lines, and we could have asked it to reduce the impedance or resistance to the line and pulled more power through that line. I'm hoping you're all looking at this and going, gosh, this sounds so obvious. Of course, utilities should do this. If it weren't obvious enough, we've taken those devices and we've mounted them on a very clever trailer that you can wheel out to any site and attach it to the line in just 8 hours and begin moving power from one line to the other. Compare this to 10 or 15 years to build a line, 3 to 4 years to reconductor or put in a fatter wire on the line. This is a remarkable solution before we begin talking about disaster recovery, maintenance, construction, and all the places where you wish you could move the power around on your grid in just a few hours. The key message here is if we're moving to this renewable world, and we are, you can't do that until you make better use of the grid that you've already got. Originally, when I submitted these slides, I had my who's who customer list, and trust me, it's a who's who list of customers. We settled on a description of those customers for this to not seem like an ad. And the reality is that 7 of the 11 largest utilities in the USA are pursuing multi-million-dollar projects with smart wires. And I want to say, these utilities are heroes. They're absolutely heroes because they're doing something that is generally against their financial best interest. They're putting in place a very low cost, very effective solution that doesn't earn them near as much capital return as if they had reconductored or built a new line. These are heroes. In Australia, all 5 of the largest utilities are either have already installed or installing our equipment on their grids, and 9 of the 10 largest in Europe are doing the same. These guys are great utilities also, maybe not as much heroes, because their incentives actually provide the proper incentive to go and do this on their grids. The bottom line here, incentives matter. If I could talk to you one-on-one for a few minutes at a time, I'm guaranteeing you I could convince you incentives really matter, and utilities do what's in their financial best interest. Despite the heroes we have in the US that have some real vision that they need to make their grids more efficient, the overwhelming majority of these utilities do what makes them the most money. 3 insights come from this. The first, if we pay utilities exclusively to spend money, that's what they'll get good at doing. Second, if there's no innovation incentive, we can't expect a lot of innovation. And third, and I told you this was going to be the surprising one, there is no crystal ball. Anybody who can look at you and tell you in 10 years, in 20 years, they know what their grid is going to look like isn't being very candid with you. The reality is, if you ask them what they predicted their grid would look like 10 years ago, and remember, most of these are public companies, so they have to show you, the reality is they're far off of what they thought the grid would look like. And if you talk to industry experts about whether we're getting better or worse at predicting what we'll need in the next 10 years, industry experts will unanimously agree we're getting far worse. This changeover in generation that we just talked about is incredibly difficult to predict. And just as much innovation is going on the consumer side. So if you can't tell me where generation is going to be, and you can't tell me what load is going to be at any one substation, how could a utility possibly predict what their grid needs to look like? Look, we work with some people who are really amazing in this industry. They're very smart, very passionate customers that we work with. But there are times where I feel like I'm in a Hans Christian Andersen story, because when someone is sitting there explaining to me they have perfect information on what the grid's going to look like 10 and 20 years out. And the reality is we all know that just isn't true. And at some point we have to admit the emperor's wearing no clothes, we can't predict the future, and we need to spend a little more time and a little more energy working on short-term needs, the things that are right in front of our face that we could be doing in the next 6 months, year, 3 years, 5 years. Because what we've really done is built a system that takes 3 to 5 years to make the simplest of decisions, because we treat every decision as though it's a 30-year investment and that you have 30-year information on what your grid's going to look like. And that's simply not the world we live in anymore. This isn't about smart wires. I picked 5 ideas just off the top of my head of solutions that are easily implementable, that can provide very quick, very fast returns, and all of these work regardless of how the grid unfolds. This is just an example of how we need to think differently about how we're managing our grids and the incentives we provide to the utilities who are forced with making these decisions.
Thank you, Greg. Susan, could you talk a little bit?
Absolutely. So these guys cheated a little bit. I didn't know they developed TED Talks. So I have some notes to talk from for you here. So I'm Susan Pope. I'm from FTI Consulting. I've worked for over 25 years in the design of competitive markets for electricity, both in the US and abroad, most notably in Canada and in Mexico. So my focus has been primarily on working with market participants and the ISOs, which are the system operators that operate the electricity grids, that are being deregulated, to set up competitive markets for capacity, ancillary services, energy, and financial transmission rights, which are basically hedging mechanisms for differences in prices between for energy at different locations on the grid. So in terms of this overall discussion where we have experts on particular technologies and the emergence of different technologies and on the need to evolve the regulatory constructs in order to accommodate those technologies, my expertise that I bring to you here is in trying to understand how to evolve the wholesale market designs in order to properly price and compensate these technologies, to encourage the investment where it's needed, where it could be most effectively deployed, bring the largest cost reduction, and doesn't have to be subsidized very much. So I'm working within organizations, the ISOs, that have evolved over the time that I've been working with them, starting in the early 90s with the formation of the New York ISO, from small little power pools that could work fairly quickly through decisions to fairly large organizations with complicated stakeholder governance structures where it's difficult to move forward and discuss new ideas and make decisions quickly. And where some of these ISOs sit within multiple states. So they have to respond to the states, the priorities and the issues of coming to them from different state offices as well as from FERC. So this has become more complicated than it was in the early days to implement change within the ISO structures with which I typically work. So again, getting back to that particular expertise I have, it's really, I think, in seeing the market design for wholesale deregulated markets, these regional markets, PJM, ISO New England, New York ISO, as a whole, and how the markets and the pricing systems that are set up in those markets for capacity and for all the other different products interact, and how there's the potential for setting rules in one market that could potentially have adverse effects on the efficiency or the ability of the other market to function. And so I think what I bring is the ability to look at that piece comprehensively in terms of thinking about how do we address climate change and how do we enable the, and encourage the development of new technologies. So the role that I'm currently playing is in working with ISOs, most notably in Canada right now, in Alberta and in Ontario, in thinking, and also say in the development of flexibility products in some of the US ISOs, in thinking about how to modify, how to enhance or create new products in these ISOs that will properly value the new technologies that are coming along. So I think all of these technologies have value, and they have value in different ways and in different places. And the job is to understand them technologically and what they bring to the grid, what they bring to consumers in terms of ability to reduce costs in different ways, and provide a way for them to gain payments, to accrue the value of what they bring. I think that Hannah just gave an excellent example where the coupling of solar and batteries has great potential. I also think, Nora spoke about it a little bit earlier, I think that energizing demand response in a lot of these industries has tremendous potential. You know, I've been working in Alberta where 70% of their demand is industrial, large industrial customers, where 30% of the cost of some of these customers is electricity. These customers can be motivated through a price signal to respond and reduce their demand when prices get very high. But what we need in order to do that is we need effective scarcity pricing in these ISOs and in these deregulated electricity markets. We need that for the technologies that Hannah's talking about, that Kelly's going to be talking about. We need the consumers to see that the price gets very high at certain times, because that's what provides the incentive to, you know, charge your car at certain times of the day, to invest in a battery, you know, to invest in a battery in order to replace upgrading the grid to serve 30 customers at the end of a line. You need that price signal. We need to be less afraid of price volatility in our energy prices. Customers need to be empowered and retailers to employ hedges, to invest in batteries, in other types of things that provide a financial hedge for that price volatility. And through that type of competitive market response, we can bring down the cost of electricity and bring these new technologies into the market. So, in addition to saying what I think the potential of some of these technologies is, I want to say what one of my greatest fears is. One of my greatest fears, because I started my work when the New York utilities were facing tremendous stranded costs as a result of PURPA investments, and they reached a deal with the New York PUC to receive a repayment of some of their stranded costs in return for setting up competitive markets. You know, the Shoreham nuclear power plant was never activated. It was never used. It was a huge cost incurred. I'm concerned that we get state-level initiatives that are going to be investing in technologies or in projects that are not justified on a market basis. And somebody's got to pay for that. And that's going to end up being shareholders in terms of stranded costs, or I think it's going to be the small customers. Because what you're going to see, and what we see in Texas, what we see in Ontario, is that large customers find a way to avoid paying those large fixed costs. If they're levied based on peak usage, for example, what you're seeing in Ontario is that customers are increasing their demand in peak hours so that they can meet the threshold, so that they can bypass transmission charges. So that's what I'm afraid of. So my biggest wishes are a cap and trade or a carbon tax, either for the whole country or for the Eastern and Western interconnect. That's the way to address carbon reduction efficiently and to help some of these new technologies garner their value. Kick up efforts to include the demand side in these markets, as Nora mentioned, and improve the connection between transmission planning and supply planning. If a battery is the cheapest way to ensure service to a customer at the long end of a transmission line, we shouldn't be building wires. Thank you.
Very insightful. Mark, you can hopefully talk about what you could do, what you've done with other industries in moving towards the best implementation of new technologies and what their impacts have been.
Okay. Well, thank you for the opportunity to talk with you. My background is I was involved in the reforms we went through in telecommunications in the United States. I spent about the last 20 years of my life at the University of Florida, where I work with countries all over the world that are trying to renovate or reform their energy systems, telecommunications, and water as well, though that has the water part has fewer lessons for it. One of the things that I think is a valuable takeaway from all the reforms is that when you undertake changing a system like this, you are creating a full employment act for attorneys and economists. So all of us in the room should feel delighted by this because we have bright futures in that regard. But in looking around and walking through these experiences in my life, I've come across what I think are three myths that we generally embrace when we're going through any kind of a sector reform, and embracing those myths tends to come back and bite us. One of those myths is we can take the components of the past and rearrange them to create the future. Just saying it a different way, you can create the future by rearranging the components of the past. That tends to never be true. But you might, if you've ever studied or read about the kind of behavioral economics, we have this heuristic that all we see is all there is. And those of us in utilities policy behave that way. We look at how things are, and we think, well, if we just simply rearrange the pieces, we'll create a different future. What happens, though, is when you start rearranging the pieces, when you start opening things up to competition, the economics of competition, the real underlying economics of the system just comes roaring out, and it creates a future that we did not anticipate. One of the biggest lessons, I think, in that for telecommunications in the US was the breakup of AT&T. The antitrust case was about manufacturing, but the breakup was all about an assumed difference between local telephone service and long-distance service. Once we opened up the markets, we found out that assumption was fundamentally flawed. The technologies the customer said they are not distinct from each other. And we went through over 20 years of regulatory decision-making, fights in the regulatory arena, court cases, et cetera, trying to undo the mistake we made in how we broke up AT&T. And eventually, as most of you probably know, we ended up putting AT&T kind of back together again because the economics said the assumption you made was wrong. But we were looking at the past and thought that's the way the world is, and that we could simply create the future in the same way as just kind of a rearrangement of the pieces. And I have to agree with Nora about what it is are the technologies that are going to be shaping the future. I don't know what they're going to do, but if you look at what the economics of blockchain, artificial intelligence, I'd throw in smart contracts, although most people would just include that in blockchain technologies. These change the these change the economics of how people make decisions and where decisions will be made. And this could, depending upon how the economics works out, and we don't know, it could drive us to larger, more expansive utility services, or it could shrink them down further. It all depends upon how the economics actually plays out. Blockchain would tend to disassemble things. Artificial intelligence could put things back together again and make them even bigger. We just don't know. But that's going to be back into my third myth that I'll get to in a moment. So let me get then to the second myth that we tend to embrace. And that is that we should, in these redesigning infrastructure systems and regulations, accommodate the business ideas that are being put on the table. The breakup of AT&T, well, I said it was driven by manufacturing, but designed around long distance. It was to accommodate MCI's business model. And eventually in our regulations, we tried to accommodate voicemail providers. We tried to accommodate the teleports of the world, the fiber optic networks. And it turned out that each time we tried to predict what markets should look like, we were wrong. And we were wrong for the reason I said before. Once you start unleashing economics, it tells you things that you did not anticipate. We're still going through it. If you've followed any of the debate in this town and around the world on something called net neutrality, it's a protection of Facebook's, Google's, and Netflix's business models from the internet service providers, trying to keep the internet in a 25-year-old technology framework. So accommodating business models doesn't tend to work out for us. In fact, one of the lessons we learned, which really surprised me, we should have gotten this if we just thought more carefully for 5 minutes. We would have gotten it because the economics isn't that complicated, but we were just simply wrong. What we discovered ex post is that when we tried to accommodate particular business models, we got less competition rather than more. And it has to do with the interactions between the incumbents and the new entrants. And I won't go into trying to explain why that's true, but the data always support that we were wrong in trying to accommodate particular business models. The third myth, then, is that we can fine-tune regulations. This is something that really surprised us. We tried to do a lot of things in redesigning rate of return regulation. We tried to do a lot of things to incentivize particular kinds of activities, and we tended to get that wrong as well. In fact, we were basically saved by the change in technology of going from wireline to wireless. So a couple of things that have been talked about that I think are worth emphasizing, or me kind of putting my perspective in on it. And one is the Averett-Johnson effect, which is interpreted as utilities invest in capital because that's where they get profits. There's an assumption in the Averett-Johnson theory that regulators allow too high of profits on capital. They always overestimate the rate of return. If that were true, then stocks and utilities would outperform the market on a regular basis. That tends to not be true. So that assumption that Averett and Johnson made in their 1960-something American Economic Review paper tended to not be true. In fact, if regulators underestimate that, then utilities will underinvest. And so you have that kind of a problem that happens with rate of return regulation. What we found in terms of what is the right kind of regulatory model for allowing a lot of innovation is to simply let go. And this is where we really miss Alfred Kahn. How many remember Alfred Kahn? Okay, a number of you do. He passed away a few years ago at the age of over 90, and he passed away way too young. Good people always pass away way too young, regardless of their age. Because one of the things that Fred Kahn brought to us was the courage to say, you regulate because there's something precious to you. And if you're going to open markets to competition, you have to let go of that precious thing. Otherwise, you're going to be mired in a mess of trying to satisfy multiple stakeholders that you're simply not going to be able to satisfy. So he always pushed for, when you're going to start allowing competition, you've got to get regulation out of the way. And what that would look like in the energy sector is probably going to be a backing off of even using rate of return tools, and probably backing off regulating a lot of prices, a lot of interconnections that we find very precious and that we want to hang on to. But as we hang on to them, we run ourselves into deeper problems. One of the things that I think is important to understand, and I'll wrap up with this, on rate of return regulation, it was never, if you read the history, it was never about regulating utilities. It was about regulating regulators. Because we regulated utility prices for a long time before we ever came up with this idea of service at cost that we eventually named rate of return regulation. The reason we came up with that system is because regulators, without being anchored in hard data, made very arbitrary decisions. And so what we have to be able to do as we move forward, if we want to let go of that, is figure out how do we anchor regulation in some sense of reality, or shrink it small enough that when it makes a bad decision, the financial consequences are fairly small. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Kelly, you represent storage. When people think of storage, they think of batteries, and I know there's a lot more. It's all
there's
yours.
so much more. Thanks. First of all, thank you for having me. I'll say, I have to tell you guys a secret. It's not just because I wore the skirt, but if you go last on a panel where there's 6 people, you pretty much just kind of say whatever they said, because they've covered it, especially with a panel like this. So I am with the Energy Storage Association. We're the national trade association for energy storage in all its forms. Yes, it includes batteries, and specifically lithium-ion batteries, but all kinds of other batteries like flow batteries and molten salt. But it also includes some of the really old-fashioned types of storage. We represent pumped hydro, mechanical storage, all across the board of technologies. And we have all across the board in terms of the stakeholders that are involved in our membership, which allows us to get a pretty broad perspective of what energy storage is, what it isn't, and what we can do about it. So I'm going to quote, I don't know if any of you know Catherine Hamilton, all of those of you in energy, but she's a friend of mine, and I'm going to quote her here, so I have to give her full credit, especially in a room full of lawyers. That she says that energy storage is like bacon. It just makes everything a little bit better. And I want to just say that that's hilarious. But the other thing is energy storage is really an enabling technology. I've heard it said that it is a disruptive technology, and I couldn't disagree more. There is no reason for energy storage on the grid to exist if it weren't for other resources like renewables, where it can firm renewables, wind and solar and even hydro, where it can help baseload inflexible resources such as nuclear, coal, wind. Also on the demand side, when you think of energy storage and the good old-fashioned hot water heater systems that can be deployable, to have that as a part of system efficiency or energy efficiency. It does all of these things, and so it's an enabling technology, if anything. What it is disruptive with, though, is the regulatory regime that is today. And so I would say it's more of a process disruptor than a technology disruptor. Here's what's going on with batteries. The installations are growing fast. I'm going to go really fast through this. I believe you can have this with your materials, but Battery installations are growing really fast. We released a study that we did with Navigant Research that showed that 35 gigawatts of new energy storage will be on the grid by 2025 in the US alone. Right now, we're at about 1. Steep cost declines. Hannah had some great numbers as well. I have a couple of examples up here of real projects that are solar plus storage or just simply storage that are cost competitive and going in the grid today. But the real thing about cost, I know we're going to talk a little bit about cost, but the real thing about the economics of storage is actually the value. Because, and this is part of why it's also a disruptive process, is that when you think about an asset and how you classify that asset, energy storage is not just a generation asset, it is not a transmission asset, it is not a distribution asset, but it can be all three of those, even in a single asset, right? So it is incredibly disruptive because you can't really put it in a certain box before you start to look at what are the values that it can bring. And so we have operational savings where you can do peak reduction, power quality, volt var, DER firming for wind and for solar. There's also an element of reliability and resilience where it can provide backup power or microgrid islanding. And there are all sorts of ancillary services revenues. For those of you who have worked in the PJM region, you'll think of the regulation product that's available. Ultimately, energy storage is about flexibility. Never before in the history of our electricity system have we been able to decouple the element of time from generation and delivery of energy. And this is what is so disruptive about this system, is we are able to provide not just more reliability, but more resilience to the grid. And here you'll see, and I won't spend much time in that because I do want to get into conversation, but there are short-term uncertainties and longer-term uncertainties. And really the issue is about value, where we as the National Trade Association for Energy Storage are really looking to make sure that we can get recompensed for the value that it's already providing to the grid. But the system just isn't set up to be able to allow for that. This is part of what FERC 841 and FERC 845 are getting at, is allowing multiple use storage to be in play. And that's it. Let's talk.
Good. You set the stage. I want to talk about pricing.
Okay.
Hannah also set the stage in my mind with her graph about the reductions in prices. And that all looks great to me. But when I stop and think about how we actually run the grid, and I think lithium-ion batteries, which are, I just moved out of California, but in California they're going to put in, what, 1,500 megawatts of lithium-ion, last maybe 10 years, 4-hour blast in the ability to cover when generation's not there. That means you got to have a third layer, and that's going to be gas or nuke. So you take those prices that were on Hannah's chart, and they're not just individual prices, you got to add them up to get to something that's reliable. How do we deal with that?
You said you were going to do your softball first before your hardball. Okay, all right, bring it.
No, these are in the topical questions for the whole panel.
Well, I think, again, energy storage is meant to be coupled with the grid, and whether that be directly with a particular resource or be on the grid at a specific location, or to be deployed during a certain time for pulling energy from the grid and dispersing it to the grid. I think that's where the play is. There is not necessarily a magic number of 4-hour duration. First of all, batteries are being installed at 4 hours all the time now, so if you're going to talk specifics about batteries. But there's also flow batteries, which are being proposed now at 10, 12 hours. And when you're talking about the even longer durations, now you're talking about, what about pumped hydro? What about other mechanical storage technologies? And even so, energy storage is not the answer to everything. That's why I was saying a little bit earlier. This is not supposed to be, we're not necessarily here to solve every problem, but it allows you that flexibility so that when we don't have the crystal ball, we can still sleep at night because we've induced flexibility into the grid.
And I'll jump in on this question too. So your premise is all supply side based, right? It's all about what technologies can be used to fully meet supply. But what you're missing is the whole demand side of the equation, right? So if your problem is that the sun is only shining at certain times, the wind is only blowing at certain times, what do you balance it with the rest of the time? Well, you can balance it with the demand side, right? You can be sending price signals, as was mentioned earlier, to customers, either residential or C&I, both, to basically say, use less now, use more now, right? And there's a tremendous amount of capacity out there to do that if you can get the price signals right, if you can get the markets for that right. And I wish I had included my slides, but I found this great chart from GridLab this morning, which is a fantastic and relatively new organization. And they basically plotted out, here's all the different customer side and third party technologies that can be used on the demand side, and here's the different hours that they can be deployed at, and to give your grid that sort of flexibility. So this is sort of the brave new world that we're moving into, right? Traditionally, you really only could move the supply side, the large central generation supply side, but now we have this whole new component of the grid that we've got the tools to really maximize, and so that's a big part of your to answer your question. And then the other thing I would just mention is also balancing areas, right? So if you're just in one geography, like, yeah, you're going to be limited by when the sun shines there or the wind blows there. But if you can expand your balancing market, which is what they're talking about with like CAISO expansion and different RTO expansion, then you can take advantage of, yeah, the wind's not blowing there, but it's blowing over there. Bring it in through the transmission lines, right? So that's part of the answer too.
Yeah, in one of my prior lives, I worked for Tres Amigas, which was going to integrate the 3 grids to be able to do exactly that. Take cheap West Texas wind that couldn't be used at night, bring it into California.
Yeah.
And then politics got in the way, which will lead to my next question. Jerry Brown comes in, rooftop solar. And even though you could efficiently move West Texas wind all the way to California and beat the economics of wind in California, we were dead. That was the end of it. And how do we keep that kind of stuff from happening? Is there some way to let the merits of the technology and the economics overrule the politics, or are we so embedded in the politics that we don't have a way out of this?
Can I jump in here? Much as I love California, I just don't think they're the role model for pretty much anything. I love their.
Thank you for saying that instead of me.
They got great ideas, but if we want an expensive way to get to green, I believe they found it. I think there's a couple of things you can do. I think that performance-based rate making actually has more transparency and economics. It addresses Gregg's issue of let's think in the shorter term, because these are shorter term. None of these are going to be 30-year, 40 or 50-year assets. National Grid in the UK is under a performance-based regime, and that's why we're a customer. And that's why business is harder, but it's why we're incented to do the right thing. So we're in a combination of CapEx, OpEx, TODEX, plus PBRs. And so I think that's the first thing you can do, so that it makes the politics tougher. Because what we haven't done is externalize what the real cost of political intervention is. We certainly know what it was in California, but nobody talks about that. They talk about Enron. Enron was one of many bad players. They actually weren't the worst. It was about infrastructure and bad political decisions. And political decisions for economic issues never work. A lesson to be learned by everybody. I think it's why we've got to get better educated regulators and policymakers, and I'm talking to somebody about helping move the old educational process for NARUC to MIT or somewhere where there's a real understanding of technologies, because people do not understand, and they're making decisions that frankly are closing out options. The third thing is, I think we have to demand more of the process. But I also think we need to say to stakeholders, you're not going to be the ultimate decision makers. I think we need people making hard decisions. I think that the stakeholder process, which I've said for years, is madness. It's the inner circle of hell. It just doesn't work, because you have too many competing interests that can never get to a real solution. And then fourth, I think we need to trust markets. Certainly we're going to be regulated, because this is a a critical need in every level of our economy and welfare. But the artificial construct on the artificial construct on the artificial construct simply makes people distrust markets. They're easier to manipulate, and they get you to the wrong decisions. There are 50 different technology solutions for many different problems, and yet we tend to zero in on one or two. So batteries have many, many, many opportunities to make a difference. They may or may not necessarily have to be held captive by having a backup. That's a decision that the economics should make, not the RTOs, not the stakeholders, but frankly, regulators are going to have to start making some more difficult decisions, but simpler decisions. A carbon price, it's simple, it's straightforward. I worry about cap and trade because in this political environment, I'm afraid it would be manipulated. I think it did get manipulated in Europe. Carbon price, straightforward, set up a bank for new technologies and get government out of the subsidy business. And I think we need to make a distinction between incentives and subsidies because they're different.
Greg?
Yeah, if I could jump in. I'm struck by how many challenges we have in the energy world, and it's so easy to get overwhelmed by the number of challenges and the things that are broken. It's amazing how much we all agree on where the world needs to go. And I think if we could pick just a few critical issues and focus on those instead of trying to solve everything, we'd get a lot further. I'm still looking for the person who's arguing against time of use pricing. I can't find the strong argument against time of use pricing. It just makes so much sense to me. By the way, it has no impact on my business really at all, but I just don't understand why we don't have it. Performance-based incentive to me is the same thing. I'm not sure who's arguing against this. If I could have everyone in this room spend a few minutes with National Grid or UKPN and watch the people in those companies, how passionately they talk about, don't pay me the same return as my competition, as the other utilities. I'm better than them. I deliver more value to my customers than these other utilities do. Why am I paid the same? And I believe we have the same thing here in the US. The Southerns, the PG&Es, the Central Hudsons of the world. These are folks who are doing remarkable things for their customers. And if we gave them an incentive and said, we're going to pay you more when you deliver more value, I believe they'd step up and say, that sounds a lot better than straight rate of return to me.
I could use some different role models for that. One that didn't build Vogel or Kemper. So just need to get that out there.
And I'm sitting here whispering under my breath, gas bottle. All you have to do is provide more service.
Can I throw a little cold water here just for a second? Not that I disagree with anything that's been said, but when we talk about, and I'd just like to explore this with my fellow panelists a little bit, when we talk about paying utilities more for giving more value, where is the money flow, right? Because I'm thinking as a former regulator, who's paying for that more value? And then is that eating up the value that I was given necessarily? Because what is it that I value? Have I monetized it? I feel like we can say these words, but I think until we get to the bottom of how you follow that chain, we're never going to convince regulators to just do it because it's the right thing to do, right? I think we have to quantify it.
So, I play every day in markets around the world, and it's one thing to think theoretically about these markets.
Yes.
I'm actually seeing how utilities act. And if I could show people how National Grid and UKPN, who are in the UK and under the Rio model, how they act, how aggressive they are about providing more value to their customers, they're not doing it because they're nice people. They're doing it because they get paid way more money. So one major utility just submitted $60 million in smart wires projects to their regulator, not as innovation, which is usually how my projects get done in the US, but as business as usual. They're getting an extra $200 million in performance incentive. That goes directly to the National Grid shareholders, not the ratepayers. Why? Because they saved $400 million with these projects for the ratepayers. So of the 400, they said, we'll give you half of the savings. This could be done all over the US. If we pay people based on the value they're providing, there it's based on savings.
Yeah, just to add to that, so what he's talking about is a shared savings mechanism, which is a typical way that you can do performance incentive mechanisms and performance-based regulation in general. And I'll just put a quick plug in. coming soon, we're actually releasing a paper in the next few weeks with RMI, Rocky Mountain Institute, and America's Power Plan about navigating utility business model reform and different ways to do it. And as part of this, we've also created a bank of case studies that talk about real-life examples where they've tried these different reforms and what the outcomes have been to date that you can actually look at. So just wanted to let folks know you can look for that, and that I think will start getting at some of your questions too.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to blow that up a little bit because we say it a lot, but unless you dig down into, that this is being tracked in real life examples, that the value has a dollar amount, has a quantifiable dollar amount, and that what's being given back to utilities is a quantifiable dollar amount that is less than what's going to customers. I mean, unless we say that outright, I think it kind of makes people concerned. Yeah.
But I also, Kelly, I would say this, it gets to what is a performance-based rate making, and it's transparency. So we tried it in telecom. Pat Wood and I used to have great debates about this. And it didn't work because the telecoms, basically the old Ma Bells that we did protect, basically threw out a lot of stuff that nobody could measure, and frankly, it didn't make a damn bit of difference because no one knew what it meant anyway. But I think what you find is we expect these kinds of outcomes, and if we don't get them, you can win, but you can also lose big time on this, and there are outperformance limitations so that you can't, like Nevada Energy, over-earn by a couple $100 million and still protect your monopoly. So I think you're right. We've got to be clear about what it is, and we have to be willing, I think, to look at them and say, are they working? One of my frustrations, frankly, at the FERC, we made a lot of market rules after California, and I would say, well, are they working? Are they doing what we wanted them to do, or are they impeding competition? So I think you have to have, again, it's a very different regulatory paradigm that you have to be actively engaged in measuring your own outcomes. So it's not only measuring utility, measuring customer acceptance, which is what Netflix and Google and Amazon do. Measuring, and there's this assumption on time of use in all these technologies. I hear all the time, customers don't really want them. Well, you know what? Not everybody customer wants anything, but some people are, I can use my Nest. To me, that's a great technology accomplishment. I would love to have a new meter, but I'm in Dominion's territory, so God knows I'm never getting that. But I think we need to kind of change our assumptions about a whole lot of things, including customers. But we need. So yeah, let's focus on a few things, but let's focus on more accountability by everyone who is involved. And then one more thing, which is the utilities and the RTOs, who ought to also be on PBRs. And regulators should not be the only gatekeepers because National Grid's in the wires business. That's the business they're in. So they're not competing with other things, but they have partners. And they're also open to competition on other levels that they don't get involved in at all. So I think we really don't want to set up a business model where we have one gatekeeper or regulation or a utility as gatekeeper. There's room for everybody in the game plan, and we need to get ourselves to kind of a different place.
And I would tend to agree with Nora in this space, I think, where I'm concerned where I start hearing the regulator approves this project and gives a reward for it. The UK went down that road, is now going down that road in energy. It went down that road in telecommunications, went down that road in water, and in both of those situations got itself into trouble because the regulator steps into the role of managing the business model. I'd much prefer that the regulator just stepped out of that completely. Yep. And if any of the businesses can cut a deal with utility where both of them get increased value, the customers are happier, good for them. I don't know why we'd need, as Nora would say, a gatekeeper on that.
I personally feel the last question in every one of these analyses should be, are we keeping it simple, stupid?
Yeah.
Just because the simpler it is, the easier it is for competing technologies to come in and grow. Companies to come in and aggregate different technologies to create products that are specific to you or Gregg or name your person in this audience, which is the next thing. There's the rest of my questions. We could go on for hours. I want to get to the audience, and I don't necessarily want you to have a question, but if you got an opinion, We'll hear
No
that.
opinions. God, we've heard their opinion. No.
No, okay, I'll take that back. If you give an opinion, then you can go, do you agree?
And if you have an opinion or a question, you have to use the microphone because we're recording this. I'll bring you the microphone.
Thank you. Christy Tezak from Clearview Energy Partners. It's great to see all the cost declines come down in various technologies, and especially the advances that can be made in making the grid more efficient. But then I wonder what happens to all of the magic regulatory math fights that happen when one technology is saying, well, I'm going to save all this money for the customer because I'm avoiding the cost over here. Meanwhile, the smart wires guy is saying, but yes, I'm dropping your costs over here already. And so how do you see some of that, sort of the fight between, the costs that you're claiming that you're reducing or the value you're substituting playing out when we have, it's a very vibrant marketplace, because I think that speaks to what, Kelly was saying, for regulators being confused in trying to make good decisions on behalf of, consumers and fair decisions for, the utilities and their investors. I mean, this is something that I think is really a challenge, is how do you figure out what is the cost being avoided? What is the real math going on here? Because it's easy to throw around numbers and show how things are changing, but where we're getting bogged down in terms of trying to forecast where the regulatory outcome comes out is where do we start balancing whose costs are better than others and sort of determining where that value chain is?
Go ahead.
Yeah. I think the answer is markets. It's usually the answer, and I think it's the answer here is markets. I know that in the UK, what they've done is they've taken a best guess of what it costs to solve various congestion constraints. Congestion is actually one of the easier ones to look at and calculate what the cost congestion is when we use the wrong plant that's too expensive because the wires weren't there to dispatch the right plant. So they've created various estimates of what those costs are, and then basically anyone can come in and propose projects and capture those savings. So I think the closer we get to markets, we're going to allow competition to find the best answer and share the savings with the customer. But the other piece is the other piece that I talked about in my introduction, which is we need to start thinking short-term and not long-term. Everything we've done in the regulatory framework is built on making these 20, 30-year decisions, and it's just naive to believe we have any ability to predict what the world's going to look like in 10 years, let alone 30. So those short-term incentives, there's many technologies and many solutions that would come and compete. Just show a market price of we'll adjust regularly what the value of this is. I think storage would step up. We'd step up. There's so many technologies. Demand response would step up. There's so many technologies that would step in if you just say we're going to have a clear, transparent value of saving money for customers.
And I would add to that remember Mark's point, which is you don't get to do business models by kind of rearranging the deck chairs on the old business model. Coming from the media markets, I can tell you it's a painful attempt that it's inevitably ends in failure. And that's kind of what we've been doing here. That's what we noodled around with in telecoms. So I think transparency, but let's just cut to the chase. This is not the same business model or regulatory model or investor model, another big issue we didn't talk about.
And I may be reiterating something that people have already said here, but to the extent that you can run a competitive process like Gregg has described, what you're doing is you're putting the investment risk on the private investors rather than asking ratepayers to guarantee that a certain price will be paid in the future when, as I think a number of people have made the point, regulators, all of us, are really, really bad at predicting what the future is going to be. And I think a lot of the reason for these competitive markets is because of that. Because the thought is, let's put the risk of predicting what the future holds in the competitive sector where that best resides, rather than sticking ratepayers with the cost of bad decisions.
That's brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
Couldn't agree more. I have one secret weapon nobody was told about. I asked Cindy Miller, who I could thank for bringing Mark to this panel, to make a list of what we all agreed on.
You have to use the microphone, though.
Yeah,
It seems
it
like
is.
one thing that you've agreed on is looking at the short term and not the long term. Or at least I hear that from a number of you. The other one is, yeah, that you can't predict long term. And I think that you've all agreed that the current regulatory framework needs changing. And yeah, no way to predict the future. What else did you hear?
I think I heard that we're better off putting the investment decision, to the extent we can, in the hands of at-risk capital and not utilities, who in my mind are just mortgaging everybody's future with whatever decisions they end up with.
Good line.
Can I just say, since this is a room full of lawyers, I want to make sure I'm on the record. I'm not sure I agree with short-term instead of long-term. I don't think that's actually realistic. I think you have to think about long-term investments because these are really large investments. And so I just want to make sure it's clear. We're not advocating for short-term instead of long-term. We're advocating for looking at the short-term benefits as well as the long-term benefits.
I totally agree. And if you add the concept of when you have to think long-term, let the market compete for who's going to make that long-term investment, which, by the way, should include utilities. They should have the right to compete just
Totally.
like everybody
Everyone
else.
totally.
Then you're really getting to a market-driven answer.
Okay.
Well, I'd like to thank this phenomenal panel. I am so excited to have been here.
Great fun.
Thank you.
And thank you, Peter Esposito. We now have a 15-minute break, and then we have 2 terrific concurrent sessions coming up. There are signs directing you out in the lobby.